Hi, I'm Teri, and you're watching the Modest Economist channel. I'm calling today's video Confessions of a Grand Jury Person, me. Years ago, I was randomly selected as the foreperson for a grand jury, and with the recent news about a certain famous individual being indicted on 34 felony counts, it brought back a lot of memories about my time on a grand jury. And I wanted to share those with you because I think the real story here is not about the person. It's actually about the fact that a grand jury was able to indict on 34 different counts. So let me give you a little background on grand jury. When you're called to grand jury duty service, you cannot get out of it. You have to go. The only thing you can do is maybe change when you go by a few months, but you have to show up. So I was in New York City and I showed up downtown at that same courthouse that you've recently seen and was absolutely stunned when my name was pulled out of this big drum with about 300 names in it to be one of the four persons that they were sitting for different grand juries. So a grand jury only has 23 people on it. And in order to get an indictment, at least this is in New York City, there have to be at least 16 people present and 12 people have to vote on the indictment. But what does a grand jury do? The only responsibility of a grand jury is to listen to the evidence presented by the prosecutor. That's it. So there's no judge. There are maybe a few witnesses. You rarely, if ever, see the defendant. You don't even know who the defendant is, although I guess in that other case, they probably figured it out, especially with some of the witnesses that did come in. The only people you really see are the bailiff, who comes in and hands you a slip with all the indictments on it, and the prosecutor, who is presenting the evidence. So the first day, as grand jury foreperson was a little bit unnerving because it really turns out it's a full-time job. You're not just sitting there listening to evidence. There's a lot of paperwork that's involved, and you have an assistant and you have a secretary. So it's actually quite involved. And my biggest concern was, nobody really looked like they wanted to be there. So how could we get through the month of August, because my grand jury duty was for a month. Yes, every day for a month I had to go downtown to the courthouse, and at least, make it easy for everybody. So the second day I asked the jury, the other members of the grand jury, if they would be willing to do the following, and that is, we listen to the evidence, we ask as many questions as we want, and then the minute we think we're done is we take a vote. And if we have 12 votes, which is how many we need to indict, then we go ahead and indict and we move on to the next case. Everyone was pretty agreeable to that, actually. And my thought at the time was that once you've heard the evidence and listened to witnesses, if there were any, you've pretty much made up your mind whether there is enough evidence. And remember, this isn't actually about the defendant, because a lot's going to happen from grand jury to maybe a trial, maybe not a trial, maybe the person pleads guilty. I mean, you just don't know. So all you're doing is saying to the prosecutor, yes, we believe that there is enough evidence that a crime has been committed. And that's it. So you kind of need to stay on track with what your job and role is. During the month that I was on grand jury duty, we listened to 52 cases. And of those 52 cases, there were only 3 where we did not vote to indict. It was pretty obvious after listening day after day to a lot of evidence that on the 3 where we did not indict, there just really wasn't enough evidence to prove that there had been a crime. So there's one thing that I learned, a lesson that I always think of being on grand jury duty, and that is how you can have 23 people in a room They're all listening to the same evidence. They're all hearing the same things from the prosecutor. We're not really having a discussion and how different people's perceptions, how different people's views, how different people interpret the information that they're given. So one of the things I did ask the members of our grand jury to do was, when we voted, if the person next to you didn't vote the same way you did, or voted and you thought they shouldn't have, that we just needed to respect the other person's opinion, because again, we were not the trial jury. We were just the information jury. And so everyone thought that that was pretty good. So that was number one. And people can have very different perceptions, very different outcomes, but we did get through 52 cases. And as I said, in 3 cases, we did not indict. Now, what really struck me about the 34 indictments was that it was 34 indictments. That's a huge number. 34 felony indictments. And I can tell you this because at the most, I think I remember having maybe 10 indictments in one case that we were looking at. But I would say it was closer to 5 to 10 charges, and that's it. So when I heard that number, 34 indictments from a federal grand jury, I thought, oh my God, that jury must have really had to work hard and work for a long time, but to agree on 34 indictments, that's a big deal. And that's what I think the news media has missed, just because most people are not familiar with how a grand jury works. So I'm going to stop there. This is going to be very interesting. And as I said, a lot can happen between a grand jury indictment and whether or not it ever goes to trial. But that was my experience, and I'm glad I could share it with you.